What if the most powerful medicine in medieval times wasn't found in a dusty alchemist's lab, but in a simple, fragrant garden? Prepare to have your perceptions of ancient healing shattered as we uncover the incredible, often hidden, medical secrets cultivated right under people's noses. Today, we step into a forgotten world, lush, green, and deceptively quiet. A place where blossoms masked cures for deadly fevers, and a whisper of lavender might heal a soul torn by plague and grief. These were no ordinary gardens. They were sanctuaries of science before the word science even took shape. And in many ways, they were far more advanced than we dare to admit. Imagine a world without pharmacies, without pills, syringes, or emergency rooms. In medieval Europe, illness was everywhere, borne on winds, spread by rats, passed by touch. Cities reeked of filth, and the common man had no access to the handful of learned physicians who wandered the courts of kings. So how, then, did people heal? They turned to the earth. To a patch of green enclosed by wattle fencing, to a convent's courtyard, or a quiet cloister behind monastery walls. These spaces, blooming with color and humming with bees, were more than just places of beauty. They were apothecaries disguised as sanctuaries, secret pharmacies where medicine grew quietly under the watchful eye of monks, nuns, herbalists, and healers. These were the medieval gardens, and they held secrets the modern world has only begun to rediscover. In the shadow of cathedrals and castles, a peculiar kind of pharmacy took root, not made of bricks or stocked with glass bottles, but crafted from soil, sunlight, and silence. It was known as the herbarium, not just a place for growing herbs, but an intentional architectural structure, a sacred space. Its layout wasn't random. It was symbolic, even alchemical. Beds of plants were arranged according to elemental theory. Earth, air, fire, and water were aligned with the cardinal directions, echoing ancient cosmological beliefs. Some gardens mimicked the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each section dedicated to restoring the body's internal balance. Foxglove, with its delicate purple bells, wasn't admired for its beauty. It was feared and revered. This was Digitalis purpurea, a plant so potent it could still a racing heart, or stop it entirely. Modern cardiology owes it a debt, but in the Middle Ages, its power was known through trial, error, and whispered lore. Administered in precise amounts, it calmed palpitations. Overused, it became a poison. Then there was the Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. Crushed into teas or thick pastes, it dulled the unbearable pain of childbirth, bone breaks, and battlefield wounds. It gave sleep when sleep wouldn't come. Monks, acting as both botanists and caretakers, cultivated poppy carefully. Not for addiction, but for mercy. Mandrake, the most infamous of them all, was harvested under moonlight, its roots shaped like a tiny, writhing human figure. Folklore warned that it screamed when pulled from the ground. Some even claimed you'd die hearing its cry. But beneath the myth was powerful medicine. Used in surgical procedures, its sedative properties rendered patients semi-conscious, still enough to endure medieval operations without screaming. These weren't isolated facts. They were part of a much deeper logic, one that fused natural observation with philosophical frameworks. The guiding principle behind medieval medicine was humoral theory, an idea inherited from Hippocrates and refined over centuries. The body, they believed, was a balance of fluids or humors. Too much black bile, and you became melancholic. Too much blood, and you were manic. Healing meant more than curing a symptom. It meant restoring balance. And plants, in their texture, color, warmth, and aroma, were matched carefully to these humors. Chamomile wasn't just relaxing. It was cooling, used to treat fevers and rages. Mint was heating, good for lethargy and digestion. Even the way a plant bent toward the sun or resisted drought spoke volumes to the medieval mind. Nature was coded with signs, and the garden was a sacred script, but gardens didn't remain secret for long. Word spread, quietly at first, through monastic networks, copied manuscripts, and the slow pulse of oral tradition. The Benedictine monasteries, in particular, became hubs of green wisdom. Their cloister gardens were laboratories long before the age of the microscope. They documented what worked, what failed, and what could be improved. Some compiled manuscripts like the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, a visionary abbess whose writings blurred the line between science, mysticism, and botany. Her garden wasn't just medicinal, it was spiritual, a reflection of divine ordered as time passed. This botanical knowledge moved beyond the cloister. Universities in Bologna and Montpellier began incorporating medical botany into their teachings. Laywomen and midwives, often dismissed in formal records, kept vital knowledge alive, passed mother to daughter, recipe to recipe. A sprig of rosemary under a pillow for nightmares. Comfrey root for broken bones. Elderflower wine to fight off the winter's chill. Then came the apothecaries, early pharmacists who operated at the crossroads of trade, alchemy, and healing. They didn't just sell dried herbs. They cultivated them, tended private gardens behind their shops, and maintained detailed records, often coded to keep knowledge from falling into untrained hands. Some even engaged in early forms of experimentation, comparing drying methods, adjusting doses, observing reactions. It was empirical, cautious, scientific in spirit, if not yet in name. But knowledge, as it always does, began to shift by the late Middle Ages. Alchemy rose in prominence. Healing gardens slowly gave way to distillation labs and metallic tinctures. Mercury, antimony, and powdered gold were sought over dandelion root or yarrow. The herbalists were pushed to the margins, sometimes even accused of witchcraft. Their gardens, once seen as sacred, were now suspect. And yet, not all was lost. Even as botanical medicine was eclipsed by chemical pharmacology, some remedies endured in folk practice. And today, modern science is returning to those same medieval gardens, reevaluating their lost cures. Studies on digitalis affirmed what monks already knew about heart rhythms. Willow bark, long used in medieval remedies, gave rise to aspirin. Turmeric, ginger, nettle, all once dismissed as quaint or outdated, are now the subjects of rigorous clinical trials. What if we've only just scratched the surface? Imagine manuscripts buried in cathedral basements, still untranslated. Imagine if certain combinations of plants, passed over for centuries, hold forgotten antibiotic properties. Imagine that medieval herbalists weren't primitive, but custodians of a living, breathing pharmacopoeia lost to time and arrogance. There's something haunting about these gardens, something that lingers in their silence. Perhaps it's the echo of a deeper wisdom, a sense that healing wasn't just chemical, but relational, that to touch the soil, to smell the leaves, to prepare a tincture with care, was part of the medicine itself. They remind us that knowledge isn't always loud, that it doesn't always arrive in a lab coat. Sometimes, it blossoms quietly in a corner garden, tended by someone who listens more than they speak. And when we dismiss the past as primitive, we risk losing the very roots that could anchor us in future healing. What if the most powerful medicine in medieval times wasn't found in a dusty alchemist's lab, but in a simple, fragrant garden? Prepare to have your perceptions of ancient healing shattered as we uncover the incredible, often hidden, medical secrets cultivated right under people's noses. Imagine a world without pharmacies, without pills in plastic bottles or antiseptics in sleek tubes. A world where the human body, vulnerable to pain, fever, infection, or heartbreak, had to rely not on laboratories but on leaves, roots, blossoms, and faith. In the medieval world, healing was not a sterile procedure. It was a ritual, a philosophy, a deep communion with the earth. And at the heart of this ancient healing system were the gardens, lush, fragrant sanctuaries humming with medicinal power, grown not just for beauty, but for survival. These gardens were not passive landscapes, meant for quiet contemplation. They were designed with purpose, coated with knowledge. Behind monastery walls, within the courtyards of apothecaries, and even in the modest plots of commoners, plants were carefully arranged in what we might now recognize as functional, intentional ecosystems. They were called herbariums, a term that invokes not just a collection of plants, but a living, breathing library of medicinal wisdom. Each leaf, each root, held meaning, and often, that meaning had been passed down through whispered lineages of monks, mystics, and healers. The design of a medieval herbarium was no accident. Every square was a lesson in symbiosis and order. Geometry met theology. The number 4, for instance, representing the humors of the body, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was often reflected in the quadrant layout of healing gardens. Each section corresponded to an element: air, water, fire, earth. And within those divisions, the plants themselves responded to these elemental theories. It was an ancient medical cosmology, one in which plants were not just remedies. They were spiritual instruments, tuned to the body's sacred balance. Foxglove, or Digitalis purpurea, with its haunting bell-shaped flowers, was used to treat heart conditions. The monks who cultivated it knew its power, even if they could not explain it in the language of cardiology. They observed, experimented, documented. When the heart slowed dangerously or beat in frantic stutters, the precise preparation of foxglove could bring it back into rhythm. Today, modern pharmaceuticals still use derivatives of its compound, proof that their knowledge was far from primitive. Opium poppy, with its vivid petals and somnolent aura, served as a balm against pain and trauma. But its use was ritualistic, cautious. Medieval healers knew well the fine line between medicine and poison. Too much could silence not only pain, but life itself. Mandrake, wrapped in mythology, its root shaped like a human form, was thought to scream when pulled from the ground, a tale repeated so often it became a kind of sacred warning. Yet it was used in surgical procedures, as an anesthetic, as a bridge between consciousness and the void. Its presence in garden plots was always accompanied by respect, and perhaps a little fear, but these gardens were not laboratories of isolated compounds. Their healing was holistic, philosophical. The humoral theory governed diagnosis and treatment. If a patient suffered from melancholy, thought to be an excess of black bile, then warming, drying herbs were prescribed: sage, thyme, or rosemary. The garden was a mirror of the patient's inner world. And the healer was not just a botanist, but a kind of metaphysical interpreter, reading the body as one might read the stars. This blend of observation, intuition, and philosophy found fertile ground beyond the walls of any one estate or cloister. The knowledge of healing gardens spread. Monasteries became nodes of preservation and innovation. Their walled gardens served as both pharmacies and training grounds. Manuscripts like the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen or the Herbarium Apulii offered richly illustrated, detailed accounts of plant properties. Some of these texts hinted at deeper, perhaps even pre-Christian sources. In the margins of certain manuscripts, we find cryptic notations, symbols not entirely Latin, instructions that read more like spells than prescriptions. As medieval universities grew, so too did the integration of garden knowledge into academic circles. Scholars debated the merits of herbs with the same vigor they brought to theology. And in homes across Europe, mothers passed down tinctures and infusions, each remedy a kind of inherited memory. Then there were the apothecaries, craftsmen of compounds, masters of dried roots and boiled reductions. They maintained gardens of their own, often secretive, sometimes fortified. Their role blurred the lines between healer, scientist, and alchemist. For while the alchemists sought to transmute matter, the apothecaries sought to balance it. But both trafficked in transformation. And as apothecaries expanded their practices, their gardens evolved into complex research hubs long before the Renaissance. Some maintained personal grimoires, part diary, part pharmacological reference, annotated with trial results, symbols, and notes and ciphers. These were not simply plant lists. They contained experiments with soil compositions, moon cycle harvesting, and combinations of herbs that produced effects still not entirely understood. Some records, once dismissed as superstition, are now being reassessed for their empirical value. The tools of the trade weren't scalpels or stethoscopes, but mortar and pestle, copper distillers, clay pots, and parchment-bound records. Healing was not an act of conquest over illness, but of coaxing the body into cooperation. And often, that cooperation began in the garden, where even the weeds might be medicine in disguise. Dandelions, nettles, plantain, all were labeled as common, yet their medicinal uses spanned everything from blood purification to digestive relief. In those days, observation mattered more than theory. Monks noticed that certain plants flourished beside others, creating microclimates beneficial for growth and potency. What we might now call companion planting was understood through experience, not textbooks. Calendula grown next to basil yielded more vibrant flowers. Wormwood protected delicate herbs from pests. These patterns, recorded in marginal notes and herbal diaries, are only now being validated by modern botany. But as knowledge spread, so too did danger. The power of gardens to heal was matched by fears they could also harm. Accusations of sorcery often targeted midwives and herbalists who worked too skillfully, especially women with deep botanical knowledge. Their ability to prevent pregnancy, ease pain, or cure fevers became suspicious in a world where suffering was believed to be divine punishment. Inquisitions were not just theological, they were epistemological. The question was, who gets to define what knowledge is safe? By the time printing presses arrived and knowledge could be more widely distributed, much had already been lost or forced underground. Herbal texts were sanitized, their mystical elements stripped out. Some remedies vanished altogether. Others were absorbed, renamed, and commercialized centuries later without acknowledging their roots. And yet, a quiet lineage survived, hidden in the folk practices of rural Europe, encoded in recipes, whispered in rituals. In these folk remnants we see the ghost of the medieval garden. Elderflower tonics for colds, chamomile tea for anxiety, peppermint rubbed into the temples for migraines. These were not novelties. They were echoes of once sophisticated healing systems, shaped by generations who observed nature not as backdrop, but as teacher. And then, curiously, the garden began to reassert itself, not through medieval monks, but through the lens of modern science. In laboratories from Germany to California, researchers began testing herbal compounds once dismissed as unscientific. Turmeric's anti-inflammatory properties, valerian root's sedative effects, St. John's wort for depression. Suddenly, the skepticism turned to interest. Clinical trials explored how traditional herbs interacted with biochemistry. DNA barcoding began to validate medieval botanical identification. We discovered that medieval herbalists, working with no microscopes or formal training, had achieved astounding accuracy in matching plant to purpose. And while we may scoff at humoral theory today, we cannot deny the intuition that shaped centuries of healing practice. But with rediscovery comes a deeper question. What else have we forgotten? What pages remain unread in archives beneath old monasteries? What species were lost to time? Plants that grew only in certain soils, under certain stars, cultivated by hands that left no name. Could it be that some of these gardens were more than pharmacies? That they were repositories of suppressed knowledge, wisdom intentionally buried, dismissed by new medical ideologies, or destroyed by fire, war, and fear? There are tantalizing clues. A 15th century herbal from Bologna references a plant said to restore memory, its Latin name untranslatable, its illustration faded. In Glastonbury, fragments of an herbarium suggest plants that don't match any known species, perhaps hybrids, or perhaps something else. Even now, botanists working in old cathedral gardens stumble upon cultivars long thought extinct. They survive because someone, centuries ago, knew not to give up on them. Knew that the garden itself was a kind of archive, not just of plants, but of possibility. And so the question is not whether medieval gardens were secret pharmacies. It's whether we're finally ready to listen to what they've been trying to tell us all along. There's a strange silence to medieval gardens today. Wander through the cloisters of an old abbey in France or trace the outline of a ruined herbal bed behind an English cathedral, and you'll feel it. Something lingers. Not just the memory of monks in brown robes or nuns whispering Latin prayers, but something more elusive. A presence, a buried intelligence. These were not just medicinal spaces, they were repositories of encoded knowledge. Not just about plants, but about how we relate to nature, to our bodies, to the divine. As we reach the final layer of this forgotten world, one truth becomes clearer. Medieval healing was never just about curing a disease. It was about restoring harmony between body and cosmos. Each plant was a mediator, each garden a microcosm of a larger universal order. This is why gardens were often designed as mandalas, circular, symmetrical, symbolic. Paths intersected not by chance, but with geometric precision, aligning with solstices or lunar phases. Medicinal beds mirrored zodiacal groupings, with plants associated with Mars placed in corners of vigor and those linked to Saturn in cooler, shaded spots of melancholy. It sounds esoteric, and yet there was method in the mystery. What we call superstition may have been an early mapping of biochemistry, of circadian rhythm, of chronobiology, cloaked in symbolic language. Today we dismiss much of this. We want data. We want molecules and metrics. But in doing so, what if we've amputated the soul from medicine? Some scholars now believe that medieval gardens preserved more than just herbal remedies. They held fragments of ancient knowledge carried across cultures: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, perhaps even Babylonian. The plant lore of the medieval West did not spring up in isolation. It absorbed centuries of wisdom transmitted through trade routes, crusades, and translations of Arabic medical texts. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine influenced European herbals just as much as Galen or Dioscorides. The gardens of Cordoba and Cairo whispered across time to those in Canterbury and Chartres. And still, not all knowledge made it through. During the Reformation and the later rise of industrial medicine, many herbariums were abandoned, their records burned, their plants plowed under. The shift was cultural, ideological. Healing was no longer a spiritual craft. It became mechanized, monetized, standardized. And in that transition, we lost not just remedies, but ways of seeing, ways of knowing. Some believe there are still books, herbals locked in private collections, never digitized, written in extinct dialects, never translated. Manuscripts where pages are deliberately missing, blacked out, overwritten. Who decided what we were allowed to remember? In a library beneath an old Jesuit monastery in Austria, a single page describes a tincture made from a now unknown flower said to soothe fever, unlock the voice of the dreamer, and calm the spirits that knock at the mind. What does that even mean? Was it a metaphor? A psychiatric remedy? A visionary aid? And in the Vatican's archives, there are indexes of forbidden texts, medical books deemed heretical. Their content, often garden-based cures tied to astrology, or plant rituals attributed to pre-Christian traditions. How many secrets were buried under the name of orthodoxy? Yet knowledge has a way of surviving. You see it in indigenous communities who've safeguarded their plant medicine through colonization and conquest. You see it in the resurgence of permaculture, forest gardening, and biodynamic farming, modern echoes of ancient techniques. You hear it when a grandmother boils ginger and cardamom to calm a cough, or when a child places mint leaves on their temples just because their mother told them it helps. Memory is tenacious. So is nature. Perhaps the real question isn't what medieval people knew, but what we have refused to remember. And as we stare down modern crises, of antibiotic resistance, of chronic stress, of environmental collapse, there's an eerie relevance to those forgotten gardens. Not because they had all the answers, but because they asked different questions. They didn't just ask, what chemical stops the symptom? They asked, what is the root imbalance in this person, in this season, in this place? We are taught to believe that advancement is linear, that medieval healing is primitive, and modern medicine is supreme. But what if history isn't a straight road, but a spiral? What if, in racing forward, we've left behind wisdom that we now desperately need? There is, today, a quiet return to the garden. It begins in laboratories studying plant genomes, in city dwellers planting balcony herbs, in doctors integrating herbalism alongside modern pharmacology, and in seekers, people like you, drawn not to nostalgia, but to deeper understanding. Because perhaps healing was never meant to be fully extracted from nature. Perhaps it was always meant to be a dialogue, a ritual, a garden. So the next time you walk past rosemary or run your hand across a patch of wild thyme, consider this. You're brushing against medicine that predates hospitals. Intelligence encoded in scent and stem. Wisdom passed down in root and resin. The medieval garden was never just a collection of plants. It was a language, one we are only beginning to relearn. If this journey through forgotten green wisdom stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Like the roots of valerian pushing silently through dark earth, your curiosity can grow deeper still. So if you found something meaningful in this story, like, comment, and subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries buried beneath official history. There's more to uncover, much more. And the next secret might just be growing in your own backyard.